When we engage in hadith criticism, we don't rely solely on the isnad, but we do depend on it to a very large extent. When we look at Orientalists, there are those who completely reject the isnad. These people evaluate hadiths only based on their content, or they use the isnad in a limited way. For example, regarding the institutionalization of hadith transmission, you will see that a great deal has been written and discussed on this topic, especially in the last 15 years. For example, if you do a survey, you'll see that a lot is being said about institutionalization. Why wasn't this being discussed 20 years ago? Let me tell you why it wasn't told. Because the common narrator theory has only become this active in our literature in the last 20 years. And the common narrator has inevitably brought issues like the institutionalization of hadith transmission and the regular convening of hadith gatherings to the forefront, prompting us to discuss and substantiate these topics. We envision an uninterrupted process of hadith transmission that starts with our Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, continuing with the generation of the companions, those trained by the companions and those trained by them, but starting from the time of the Prophet. Orientalists generally do not accept a process of hadith transmission that begins from the time of the Prophet himself.
Hello to everyone from the Istanbul School. Dear viewers, today we will be talking about the science of Hadith and Orientalism. Our guest is Associate Professor Dr. Fatma Kızıl. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks here.
How are you?
I'm well. I hope you are well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Professor, in our previous program, we talked with you about the science of Hadith and the reliability of Hadiths. Today, we also want to look at it from the perspective of Orientalists. We want to address both of these together. So how does the West actually view Hadiths? We want to evaluate it from this angle as well. What do you think? From the Orientalist perspective, how should the science of Hadith be evaluated? What is the impact of the Orientalists?
Well, when it comes to the Orientalist view of Hadith, first of all, we need to establish that it is different from ours. This is inevitable, as they have a different worldview. They have a different historical experience. They come from a different tradition. So for that reason, we need to read their works with an awareness of these differences. The most important difference, of course, is the issue of the Prophet Muhammad's prophethood. Since no Orientalist accepts the prophethood of our Prophet, they approach him as a historical figure. Now, it might seem as if considering him as a historical figure doesn't have any negative consequences. But ultimately, there is information about the unseen in the Hadiths. There are examples where he foretold the future. There are also examples where he gave information about past nations. It is impossible for an Orientalist to accept these. Therefore, they reject these kinds of reports a priori, that is, without any investigation. This is a very fundamental difference. Let's make that clear. At the second stage, one of the important premises of classical Hadith criticism is the value of the companions for Muslims. Now, we are not claiming that the companions are infallible. We do check the companions in terms of their accuracy. In fact, they also checked each other. For example, Hazrat Aisha criticized other companions. She would say things like, the Prophet did not say that, you heard it wrong, you missed something, you misunderstood it. Other companions also criticize one another. So it's not just Hazrat Aisha who offered criticism. We take this as an example as well, and we examine the companions in terms of accuracy, whether they understood the hadiths correctly, transmitted them accurately, heard them properly, or perhaps remembered them incompletely. In this respect, we critique or, let's say, analyze them. But when it comes to what we call justice, that is the issue of whether the companions attributed falsehoods to the Prophet, we do not open this topic up for debate in classical hadith studies. In other words, we do not consider it possible that Abu Bakr, Umar, or Aisha could have attributed a lie to the Prophet. For Orientalists, however, the companions do not hold such a value. Therefore, leading figures in academic hadith studies like Goldzihar can easily claim, for example, that Abu Huraira could have fabricated hadiths. This is not something we can accept in classical hadith studies. But let me emphasize this point. We do say that Abu Huraira could make mistakes. In other words, we do not consider the companions to be sinless, nor do we regard them as academically perfect. Among the companions, there were those who were jurists and those who were not. So in matters of jurisprudence, the opinions and narrations of the jurist companions are given priority. We already possess this kind of sensitivity. But there is something else to consider. In fact, this is a premise. In a way, every branch of knowledge has its own set of premises. One of the indisputable premises in the science of hadith is that the companions would never attribute a lie to the Prophet. In my opinion, this is not even a particularly fantastic premise. Just think about it this way. Would you ever attribute a lie to the Prophet? In other words, is it possible for someone who saw him, lived in his presence, and was influenced by him to say something he never said, something you yourself would never do? That's why we approach the issue from this perspective. There is a difference in this regard from the perspective of Orientalists. Another point is this. That's why the hadith literature, actually we mentioned this in the very first episode. So how is someone without a background in hadith supposed to read hadiths? When you open a hadith book, you might see different narrations on the same topic, and all of them could be authentic. Because sometimes the Prophet would give rulings specific to an individual, and sometimes he would change his rulings as circumstances changed. Sometimes, in other words, an incident would occur, and he would make a statement in response to that incident. Sometimes he might react as a father. We have narrations of this kind as well. We evaluate all of these together. And we spend time considering whether this is a general ruling or a ruling specific to an individual. Sometimes there are also mistakes that originate from the narrator. Two trustworthy narrators might transmit two different things from the Prophet. And we try to determine which of these is more accurate using certain methods. For example, when Orientalists encounter such narrations, they never spend time working on them. If they see narrations that appear to contradict each other, they immediately reject them. This is also a significant difference. Another difference is the chain of transmission isnad. When we critique hadith, we don't rely solely on the isnad, but we do depend on it to a large extent. When we look at the Orientalists, there are those who completely reject the isnad. They evaluate hadiths only based on their content, or they use the isnad in a very limited way. What I mean is, the difference is not just that they belong to another religion, have a different worldview, or come from different teacher-student traditions. There are also differences between us in terms of scholarly premises. So we need to read Orientalists with this awareness.
Well, Professor, there are certain things that Orientalists, do not accept. We also have judgments that we accept directly and base our views on. For example, we accept prophethood. We have certain perceptions related to the religion we accept, and we conduct research based on these. Couldn't we also think that when they conduct research without accepting these, it would result in a more objective perspective? Or how might this affect their objective or unbiased point of view?
I understand this. It's generally possible for such a thought to come to mind. But let me say this, there is actually no such thing as absolute objectivity. They also come from a certain scholarly tradition and approach the issue with the baggage of that tradition. The most important example of this is their perspective on the concept of tradition. For example, we can think about it this way. For us, for instance, tradition doesn't have an entirely negative meaning, nor does it have an entirely positive meaning, but it does have a valuable meaning. In other words, we see tradition as a process that advances cumulatively through accumulation over time, how should I put it, step by step. That's why, for example, when Imam Maturidi made any arrangement regarding theology in the 4th century, I don't think this was a development completely independent from the hadiths of the Prophet and the Quran. We believe it developed through the process of interpreting them. That's what tradition is like, and we pay attention to the scholarly trajectory that Imam Maturidi followed. You can think the same way for Imam Azam Abu Hanifa. In other words, we trace his chain of transmission all the way back to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Why? Because we believe that this knowledge of jurisprudence develops step by step. But Orientalists view the concept of tradition negatively. Why? Because their own concept of tradition is negative. Let's think of it this way. For example, consider the situation where certain gospels were chosen as canonical among many different gospels. For them, tradition is something that obscures the truth. That's why their negative attitude toward tradition can also lead them to view, for example, what our scholars are trying to do in a negative light. Or let's think of it this way. Since figures like Hazrat Aisha or Hazrat Ali do not hold the same value in their minds as they do in ours, they may approach any narration about them with immediate suspicion. There are such situations.
In fact, from a different perspective, they also have their own biases.
Well, it's like this. They also come from a scholarly tradition. Just as we rely on scholars like Ibn Hajar, Ibn al-Salah, or earlier scholars, they, for example, rely on the framework established by Goldziher. For instance, Shakt absolutely does not accept the authenticity of legal narrations. And even though there are so many Orientalists who criticize Shakt, all of them ultimately say the following. For example, there is an Orientalist named Noel Coulson and there's Harold Motsky. They seriously criticize Shakt. That's why I'm giving them as examples. But both of them clearly state the following. Schacht's theory is valid in its general outlines. In other words, what makes them say this are their own traditions and their own biases. That's why a study without bias is simply not possible anyway.
Yes, actually, what immediately came to my mind is this. With technology, with artificial intelligence, maybe when studies are conducted in a way that is not human-driven, could they be unbiased? But even here, we encounter a system that is subject to the judgments of the programmers.
And artificial intelligence will also pull data. In the end, that data will be things written by you, me, or others. So it will blend that data itself. Therefore, it's about what is presented to it, what is taught to it, because something is being taught to it. That teaching process, again, I mean, look, Orientalists do this too. For example, let's think about it this way. The issue of miracles. For a believer, it's impossible to reject the matter of miracles. That is, if you believe that the Prophet received revelation, you also accept miracles. But an Orientalist looking from the outside will reject these kinds of reports without even doing any research. They don't even attempt to date them at the very least. For example, in my opinion, this is a significant bias when we look at it from the outcome.
Now, you've touched on this a bit, but when we criticize Western Hadith researchers and their studies, what should we take into consideration? One of these is their prejudices or perspectives. What else should we keep in mind?
Actually, we need to be aware of this. As you said, they come from a different tradition. I usually always say this. I've said it a lot in other talks as well, so this will be a repetition. It's something I always tell my own students too. I find the works of Orientalists very valuable. I find their meticulousness, academic skills, and their success in finding data to be very impressive. But they always interpret this data from within their own tradition. That's why what we need to do is consider how we can interpret this data from the perspective of our own tradition. For example, what kind of explanatory approach can we bring to this? Let's say the simplest example is the issue of common transmitters. We see certain clusters in these net structures. For example, Orientalists see these clusters as suspicious. Think of it like a tree, and there are concentrations on certain branches. But how can we explain this? When we started to examine this based on such criticisms, for instance, we saw that we could explain it through the systematization of hadith transmission. Or we saw that we could explain it by the large-scale collection of hadiths and by the students who regularly received hadiths from the narrators who compiled these hadiths. The issue is the same, the diagram is the same. The concentrations in the diagram are the same, but the interpretation is different. So to what extent can we benefit from the Orientalists? In my opinion, it is very valuable that they have identified this pattern of concentration I mentioned earlier. Yes, this is important in that respect. But at the next stage, it's not about their interpretations, but rather how can we understand this? We need to pay attention to this. That's why completely ignoring or not considering the works of Orientalists at all. This could have been done 20 years ago, let me tell you that. So you are talking about making use of them as needed. Now, there are hadith studies being conducted both in Turkey and in the West. Benefiting from these is actually a form of interaction as well. To what extent are we interacting with each other? Is this enough? Do you think it's possible to collaborate? Actually, here's the thing. In my opinion, this could increase even more with artificial intelligence, because now the problem of translation has been eliminated. Currently, very valuable studies are being conducted in Turkey, but they weren't reaching the West. Well, but today I see that some of the people I'm in contact with are also following Turkish articles because they can translate them very easily. This will lead to an increase, and of course it also brought another advantage. We also had problems writing in foreign languages. For Turks, the language exam. But in some way, with artificial intelligence, we've also overcome these translation problems. More articles and books are being translated into English. This will also create a connection in this way. And also, with various scholarships and incentives, the number of people going to universities in the West is steadily increasing. Here, various organizations are being formed and Orientalists are being invited to seminars and symposiums. So I think that cooperation will continue to increase even more compared to the past.
Well, Professor, you mentioned artificial intelligence and you talk about interaction through language, through foreign languages. But what about a common language through concepts? Do you think it's possible to establish a common language for hadith studies between Westerners and Muslims?
Well, unfortunately, my answer to that is negative. It's negative in this sense. Our terminologies are different from each other. The crystal method is the science of rules and terms, and we have a lot of terms. Orientalists are aware of these terms, but sometimes they assign different meanings to them, and sometimes, as I mentioned earlier regarding the issue of common narrators, we use the same term but attribute different meanings to it. For example, some Orientalists call such a person a fabricator of hadith. But we say no, these are narrators who collect and transmit hadiths. That's why, because concepts inevitably carry a worldview, and they are also the result of the history of hadith. Orientalists envision a different history of hadith than we do. What I mean is this. We envision an uninterrupted process of hadith transmission starting from our Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, first the generation of the companions, then those raised by the companions, and then those raised by them, and so on. But starting from the time of the Prophet. Orientalists generally do not accept a process of hadith transmission that begins in the time of the Prophet. This also affects their understanding of the term sahih, authentic, in this matter. The term isnad, their understanding of isnad and the dates they assign to the beginning of isnad is why I find it difficult. So cooperation is possible. As I mentioned earlier, perhaps joint projects can be carried out, but there will still be differences in how the results of these projects are interpreted. But a common terminology seems difficult.
Actually, Professor, you've painted a rather negative picture. Isn't there a positive side to this? I mean, how should we view this? How can we benefit from the positive aspects of the Orientalists' work?
Now, we've mentioned that they come from a different tradition. This is generally, yes, the reason for negative outcomes. But here's the positive side. Well, since we are usually very closely involved with hadiths, sometimes looking at something too closely can prevent us from seeing certain patterns. Or there are things that we might call anomalies in need of explanation. In other words, things that fall outside the norm. Through the narrators. For example, the fact that certain narrators always appear with specific names in the chains of transmission, or I don't know, that only certain narrators report on specific topics. There are many such differences. We can have difficulty noticing these. I can say that Orientalists are more successful at identifying these patterns and perhaps at detecting the problematic aspects. Their approach of skepticism, of methodological doubt, also plays a role in this. That's why their work gives us the opportunity to explain and notice these things. In fact, Orientalists present us with issues to be solved. Now, whenever I say this, I get a bit worried. I mean, is it really a good thing to generate issues? From an academic perspective, it is a good thing. And here's why. If the person in front of you asks you a question about the literature and brings into question something you would normally accept without debate, you are then compelled to provide evidence for it. So is this really true or false? First you answer that, and then if it is true, how can I provide evidence for it? That's why Orientalism makes our perspective on the literature more substantiated. I mean, there's a saying by Semil Maurice. I repeat it very often. Our answers are limited by our questions, he says. And I find it valuable that they put these questions before us. It's the same from an academic perspective as well. In other words, they open up new fields of study for us. For example, regarding the systematization of hadith transmission. In the last 15 years, much has been written and discussed. If you do a review, you'll find a lot has been said about systematization. Why wasn't this being said 20 years ago? Let me tell you why it wasn't being said. Because the theory of the common narrator has only become this active in our literature in the last 20 years. And the common narrator theory inevitably brought up issues for us to discuss and substantiate, such as the systematization of hadith transmission and the regular convening of hadith gatherings. It put these matters before us. In this respect, I find the work of the Orientalists valuable. Let me also say this. Let's not forget that they have far more resources than we do. Now let's consider our universities in terms of education. For example, let's think about universities that rank in the top 100 or top 500. Let's consider the institutions where these Orientalists received their education. Their sense of history is very strong. Among us, sometimes a hadith scholar doesn't properly know fiqh, and a fiqh scholar doesn't properly know hadith. Let alone that, a theologian usually doesn't have a background in other fields either. And we generally see that those from other fields also lack a background in theology. But when I look at the Orientalists, I see that they have a very strong sense of history and they study Islamic history by placing it within the context of world history. This is very valuable. That is, as a part of the Near Eastern geography. For example, by establishing the connection of pre-Islamic traditions with that region. For example, we usually think of the Arabian Peninsula as a completely isolated region. However, the studies of Orientalists show us that, on the contrary, there were Christians and Jews here. And the belief in one God had already begun here before our Prophet. Peace and blessings be upon him. For example, what we know as the Hanifs but often overlook, these are actually their practical counterparts. So I think we can benefit from them as well.
We continue to study through them. We keep noticing these differences, but there are still many topics to work on and reflect upon. Hopefully we can open a window from here as well. Thank you very much for your valuable comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Dear viewers, today we talked about the science of Hadith and Orientalism. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.